Welcome to On What Slender Threads, Tradition 1. My name is Lynn. This is based on a book I wrote titled On What Slender Threads, AA's 12 Traditions from a Historical Perspective. However, it's not necessary to buy the book unless you'd like to have it as a resource. It is my hope that these video presentations will highlight what I learned from studying research historians' work on AA's early history, from the literature available at the General Service Office of Alcoholics Anonymous, and from the experiences and insights of AA friends all around the world. I am not a spokesperson for AA, therefore any inferences in this study are strictly my own and in no way reflect the opinion of Alcoholics Anonymous. I hope it will be helpful. I like to start with a preamble that fits the tradition for each presentation. For the first tradition, I chose AA's Statement of Unity. This we owe to AA's future, to place our common welfare first, to keep our fellowship united, for on AA unity depend our lives and the lives of those to come, from the AA Service Manual. Tradition 1, in its shorter form, states, our common welfare should come first. Personal recovery depends upon AA unity. Well, what did Bill mean by our common welfare? If we look at the original point, which is the longer form, Bill referred to those as the original points to assure our future. He said, each member of Alcoholics Anonymous is but a small part of a great whole. AA must continue to live or most of us will surely die. Hence, our common welfare comes first, but individual welfare follows close afterward. He said, AA must continue to live or most of us will surely die. And then he follows that with hence, our common welfare comes first. The 12 and 12 is a collection of 24 essays that Bill wrote about the steps and the traditions. I'm going to highlight some of the critical phrases in Bill's essay on the first tradition. They're critical to me because I only gave them a superficial nod for 20 years. Now I'm seeing how much I was missing in what he was trying to share with us. In the essay on Tradition 1, Bill refers to the unity of Alcoholics Anonymous as the most cherished quality our society has. We stay whole or AA dies. As a result of this study, I realized Bill was concerned with all of Alcoholics Anonymous. He said our world arteries would no longer carry the life-living grace of God. World arteries means all of Alcoholics Anonymous is one group carrying the message to the alcoholic who still suffers. And then he assures us that our individual right to think, talk, and act is preserved. But he goes on to say, too, that the 12 traditions aren't mandates. He says, they repeatedly say we ought, but never you must. Then Bill will go on to talk about how people resisted the idea of the traditions. When he describes some of these statements in his essay, he's repeating what he heard from early members and from the foundation trustees. He said, to many minds, all this liberty for individuals spells sheer anarchy. He says, how can such a crowd of anarchists function at all? How can they possibly place their common welfare first? What in heaven's name holds them together? And he is really talking to people who pushed back against the idea of the traditions. But his answer is consistent. He says the key to this strange paradox, the AA member has to conform to the principles of recovery. When Bill refers to principles, he's talking about our 12 steps. He says his life depends upon obedience to spiritual principles. Moreover, he finds he cannot keep this priceless gift unless he gives it away. And then a statement that I had missed for so long. He says, The moment this 12-step work forms a group, another discovery is made that most individuals cannot recover unless there's a group. Our group is a form of 12-step work coming together. We are but a small part of a great whole, and no personal sacrifice is too great for the preservation of the fellowship. He goes on to say that at the outset, how best to live and work together as groups became the prime question. I was shocked when I realized that I had been reading that phrase for years as how to live and work together in my group. But that's not what he said. Unity to him was living and working together as groups, all of us together. He said, as we had once struggled and prayed for individual recovery, just so earnestly did we commence to quest for the principles through which AA itself might survive. And then finally he says, on the anvils of experience, the structure of our society was hammered out. I had blown through that phrase for so long until finally I looked at it again and realized that he was linking unity to the structure of our society. He was linking unity to the general service structure. We'll talk a lot about that in this study. And then he uses the Eddie Rickenbacker metaphor, where we all have to consider the others, and we have a frail craft, and there's lots of defects, and we may have lots of uncertainty, pain, fear, and despair, and there may even be the death of one. But he says, so that it's been by AA that faith by works, we have been able to build upon the lessons of an incredible experience. They live today in the 12 traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous. I read that essay now completely differently. I now know he was talking about AA as a whole. So I had to ask when I looked at the history, though, unity? What unity? Bill somehow knew that AA would probably not survive for very long without its founders. After all, how would it survive the test of time when all of its predecessors had failed? Past crusades included the Washingtonians of the mid to late 1880s, the Emmanuel movement of the 1910s, and the Peabody method of the 1920s. Each endeavor initially had substantial success, but none could endure the difficult test of time. Like past movements, the early fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous was initially experiencing success. So maybe the fledgling fellowship needed a code of conduct that would outlive its founders. Furthermore, there probably had to be complete agreement to abide by that code. Now, given these two seemingly impossible constraints, Bill's solution was the 12 traditions. Ironically, the miracle of AA today is that the traditions so far have been instrumental to the fellowship's survival, even without AA members' compliance and without complete agreement to its principles. So far. Let's go back to October 1949 in a Grapevine article when Bill wrote about the 80,000 AA members of that time. He said, "We may, if we are worthy, surely expect an equal unity for AA as a whole." Bill's expectation for unity was at best aspirational, given AA's early adolescent years. But what was Bill's idea of unity? Would unity be assured if Bill handed out a set of 12 guidelines for the AA groups to follow? Now, picture him talking about these points to the 360 or so groups that were operational when he was traveling the country around 1946, 1947. How could I ever imagine that just handing these groups a set of guidelines would hold AA together? No, because individual groups would start eliminating or changing the guidelines to suit themselves. The only way the points would be effective is if they were a code of conduct for a conference of representatives from AA groups. So while he traveled the country in the late 40s, he wasn't trying to sell the 12 points to assure our future to the individual groups. Bill believed that unity was only possible if AA groups had a voice, a vote on policies that affect AA as a whole. He was trying to get the groups to agree to participate in a conference. He articulated that dream when he wrote the concepts in 1962, which begins with the first concept that says, the final responsibility and ultimate authority for AA World Services should always reside in the collective conscience of our whole fellowship. The points, then, were the guidelines that the conference would have to follow. Therefore, at the time, the groups were more interested in the conference since its members would have to follow these guardrails. I'm going to say it again because it took me so long to get it. The traditions were Bill's pathway to the conference. It was the conference that would ensure unity. So notice that phrase, collective conscience, in the first concept. And fasten your seatbelts because this workshop examines the mistakes, obstacles, and foibles, the bumpy ride of a young fellowship trying to become responsible for itself. It began with Bill's intuitive thought that he would always need to consult the group for anything that was going on in AA. As early as late 1937, Bill sought the Akron Squad's support to find better ways to spread the message of recovery. A heated discussion and a vote resulted in support, albeit half-hearted. So, April 1938, Bill had to come back after trying to raise money to little or no avail and told the squad that maybe we need to write this book. He presents his case, but the squad has had time to think about it. And no vote was called because he could tell they were going to vote it down. He was going to lose the vote. So he doesn't call a vote, and he sometimes believed that the group could be wrong. And in May 1938, Bill started writing. Pre-Big Book now, there was a glaring lack of unity in the recovery program. Why was the book so important? Because in 2 years, there was already a mishmash of programs. Akron-Oxford groups had the 4 absolutes, honesty, unselfishness, love, and purity, and the 5 C's, confidence, confession, conviction, conversion, and continuance. Hank P., Bill's first AA friend in New York, had 4 steps derived from the 4 absolutes. Nonetheless, it didn't matter. The message depended on the messenger. It depended on who was carrying the message, and there were multiple variations that could be summarized in 3 steps, according to William Shaberg. Admit your neglect, surrender your life to God, and act accordingly. That is, pray, meditate, and help others. Bill seemed to have difficulty articulating the program. He focused on writing the other chapters with Hank's prodding, and he was seeking input from the fellowship in New York, who had a lot to say about his chapters. Akron wasn't responding quite as much. There was a lot going on, Bill, Hank, and Fitz were scrambling to raise money. The trustees on the Alcoholic Foundation were managing the Rockefeller donation, but they weren't looking for any more outside funding. In an act of desperation, they came up with the stock idea. That is, Bill and Hank came up with that idea, but no one was buying. So by November 1938, Bill still hadn't articulated the recovery program. And then came another heartbreak. Ebby T. relapsed again, and not only did he relapse, he took two alcoholics living with Lois and Bill out with him. In all of that despair and all of that sadness in December, Bill started to write How It Works. And it's no wonder that the first paragraph is all about people who don't get this simple program. Talk about leading with your chin. So I can't help but feel Bill was thinking about Ebby when he wrote that paragraph. But then he goes on, he finishes the book, and before the book is published, there are 80-ish word-of-mouth program recovered alcoholics who have all done the program lots of different ways. But still, there was no unity once the program was written. I mean, after all, none of the recovered alcoholics of that day had worked the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. April 10, 1939, Cornwall Press printed the 4,650 books. But if there was very little unity before, the completion of the book left a wake of dissension and disagreement. Bill D., our alcoholic number 3, and Earl T., the co-founder of the Chicago groups, decided to withhold their stories because they thought the big book was commercial. By the end of the Flying Blind period, Bill's attempts to foster unity in the fellowship fell far short of the ideal. Needless to say, it was a very slow and discouraging start to selling the big book. Bill and Ruth Hawk were trudging to the post office to see only a trickle of inquiries. A month after the book came out, Bill and Lois, completely broke, must move out of her childhood home. And worse yet, sometime between August and September of 1939, Bill's best friend, Hank P., relapsed. Bill had to have been discouraged and depressed. All he ever wanted to do was reach as many alcoholics as possible. Bill had less than 5 years, and the first few months after printing the big book were miserable. But then, as Bill likes to say, when the tide changed, it was a tsunami. Late in 1939 into 1940, a series of publications helped get the word out. Liberty Magazine, with a bit of a cringe factor, and the Cleveland Plain Dealer articles helped with this venture. These are our early forays into public relations. So, because of those, we went very quickly from 80-ish members to 2,000 members in 2 years. Now, I'm not sure how they defined members. These were certainly people who had contacted headquarters and said that they were benefiting from the group, from the book. But what was fascinating to Bill was that hard drinkers were getting sober, but they were concerned because they weren't having a spiritual experience. This prompted Bill, after the book had been out for 2 years and they were ready for a second printing, to write the appendix on the spiritual experience. That is, the change that we have is slow, an educational experience. And then 8 months later, thanks to Jack Alexander's Saturday Evening Post Office article, the membership has grown to 8,000-ish. As Bill described it, a real Niagara Falls then broke loose, and we were deluged with letters, and with alcoholics by the thousands. This sudden growth ushered in a period of awful uncertainty. The big test of AA's unity began in earnest. But I had to ask, was there AA unity? Not really. Not yet. So Bill goes on to say in Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age that he's gone from counting members to counting groups. And he gives wonderful examples in that book about how it happened. One of my favorites is Mort J. How it worked when someone got sober and travels to another city to start a group. Mort got the big book in Colorado. He threw it in his suitcase and he drank all the way to Los Angeles, pulled it out of his suitcase, and then read it. And lo and behold, he got sober. He started a group. In Los Angeles, there were groups getting started with Mort's help, and they asked for help from New York. They said, send us some AA folks who are sober. But unfortunately, they failed miserably. There was something about crossing the Mississippi from the east to the west that just didn't appear to work well. Boston experienced the same thing. They had the wonderful founder, Patty, who couldn't stay sober, but the people he helped could, and so Boston slowly began to grow. By 1944, Bill had contended with 10,000 alcoholics, many of whom were in 360 groups, most of whom knew far better than he how AA should operate. As Bill was at headquarters watching AA grow and watching AA fall apart, he said the group's worries and problems seemed endless. Committees quarreled, new clubs had unheard of headaches, orators held forth, groups split wide open. Some members turned professional, selling AA therapy for money to new prospects, while other groups got drunk. Local and public relations went haywire. Such was the beginning of a truly and frightening experience that lasted a long time. As it turns out, Bill found out that leaders were, and maybe they still are, a barrier to unity in the fellowship. He said that the big test of AA's unity was challenging because recovered alcoholics who had started groups had their own ideas of what the program of recovery should be. Like all books, the big book was subject to interpretation, and the interpretation that prevailed was usually delivered and reinforced by the person who started the group. For example, Clarence S. had a very Christian-focused view of the big book, so his groups were Christian-focused, and Ray W. was an atheist, and he took the big book and told people to forget about this God stuff, that you could get sober without the God stuff. People were left feeling a little bit confused. Bill lamented about leaders. He said, pride and fear and anger, these are the prime enemies of our common welfare. So, as Bill pointed out, the early days were fraught with danger because of relapses, and they were very concerned about out-of-bounds romances, but they found later that these discomforts could work themselves out. But the worst part that imperiled the fellowship was the desires for power, for domination, for glory, and for money. So under these conditions, how could and how can AA survive the test of time? Thankfully, Bill did not hesitate to take on the impossible dream of AA's unity and common welfare. In the April 1946 issue of The Grapevine, Bill began the series on the 12 points to assure our future, which he said were codified into a set of principles that could offer tested solutions to all our problems of living and working together and of relating our society to the outside world. While battling depression and resistance from old-timers and the trustees on the Alcoholic Foundation's board, Bill traveled the country for over 3 years peddling the points. And at the same time, he was peddling his hope for a conference of representatives from AA groups, his anchor for AA unity. The points provided the guidelines that the conference would have to follow. The reception to the points by the existing groups was at best disinterest, if not outright rejection. However, they were interested in the conference, especially with those guidelines, because the conference couldn't change their requirements for membership. The groups could be autonomous. The primary purpose would be to carry the message to the suffering alcoholics. So that's a pretty good idea, a conference of delegates that have to follow those guidelines. Ironically, the adoption of the points was made possible by the desperate need of new groups. Established groups would take longer to recognize the value of the points for solving their own group problems. In the meantime, Bill was quick to share the points with the newly forming groups, eager for some guidelines. In effect, Bill had hoped that the points would serve as a sort of a study guide to help groups pass the big test of AA's unity by participating in the conference. But for almost 5 years after he penned the 12 points, the fellowship itself and the trustees would push back. They would struggle with the idea that the conference could serve as AA's measure of unity. After that, it would take the fellowship over 10 years to be willing to take full responsibility for Alcoholics Anonymous. We will explore this rocky journey as we discuss the rest of the traditions. So Bill's essay answers the question. His reminder is, so at the outset, how best to live and work together as groups became the prime question. As I realized after this study, Bill did not say as a group, but as groups. Working the first tradition has changed in my understanding. I believe now that he meant for unity to be a commitment to be part of the general service for all AA groups worldwide. And groups participate by having an active general service representative. As Bernard Smith said in 1954 about the conference, he said, "We may not need a general service conference to ensure our own recovery. We do need it to ensure the recovery of the alcoholic who still stumbles in the darkness 1 short block from this room. We need it to ensure the recovery of a child being born tonight, destined for alcoholism. We need it to provide, in keeping with our 12th step, a permanent haven for all alcoholics who, in the ages ahead, can find in AA that rebirth that brought us back to life." Bernard Smith, our non-alcoholic trustee, hoped that AA would survive the test of time. So how is finding unity for solving our problems possible with a bunch of self-serving alcoholics? How do we bring alcoholics into a group from all over the country, all over the world, and get them to agree? Well, the answer is coming up in the second tradition. If you have comments or questions, or you want to be on the mailing list for upcoming workshops, please email me at whatslenderthreads@gmail.com. And for other resources and workshop flyers, see my website, www.onwhatslenderthreads.com. And thank you.